What you're about to witness isn't just a political debate, it's the anatomy of a reckoning, a quiet storm that gathered in plain sight. And when it finally hit, it didn't just shake the stage, it stirred something deeper in millions of us watching from home. It was the kind of moment that leaves you breathless, not because someone shouted the loudest, but because someone stood the calmest. Not because she came to perform, but because she came prepared, with facts, with courage, with history in her hands. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't throw insults. She opened a folder, and the entire room changed. But before that moment, before the applause, the headlines, and the hashtags, there was a journey, a life, a purpose forged through courtroom battles, sleepless nights, and a fire lit by injustice. Because the truth is, Jasmine Crockett didn't become a warrior on that stage. She had always been one. And to understand how this woman, in her very first term in Congress, stood up and stunned a former defense official on live TV, we need to go back, not to the town hall, but to where the fire first began. Let's start at the very beginning, with the story of a young girl from Texas and the fight that chose her before she ever chose it. Long before the folder, long before the applause and the viral clips and the political earthquake, there was Jasmine, just Jasmine. A girl growing up in Dallas, Texas, raised by a family that believed in decency more than display. Her mother was a public school teacher who graded papers late into the night, and her father a postal worker with hands calloused by labor but eyes soft with pride. Jasmine learned early that the world didn't always reward goodness, but you had to choose it anyway. That was the code of her household, unspoken, unshakable. She wasn't born into power. She was raised on principle. That day still played in her mind sometimes like a film reel stuck on loop. A 19-year-old black man arrested during a peaceful protest, accused of assaulting an officer. The body cam footage was blurry, inconclusive, they said. The officer's testimony was polished, practiced. But Jasmine had found something, a 10-second clip on a witness's cell phone. It showed the officer pushing the young man, not the other way around. It was small, it was grainy, but it was truth. When she played it in court, the room went still. The prosecutor blinked. The judge adjusted his glasses. And for the first time, Jasmine felt the weight of silence bending in her favor. The case was dismissed. The boy's mother wept. Jasmine stood quietly, folder in hand, not celebrating, just breathing. That moment didn't make her famous. It didn't trend. But it taught her something priceless. That the truth, when revealed with clarity and precision, doesn't need to shout to shake the room. Still, Crockett knew her journey wouldn't be paved with gratitude. She took cases no one wanted, wrongful terminations, housing discrimination, police overreach. Her name began to circulate in whispers, then in headlines. The firebrand attorney from Dallas. Too radical, some said. Too black. Too loud. Too angry. But Jasmine had learned long ago that being underestimated wasn't a liability. It was her camouflage. While others dismissed her, she prepared. While they whispered, she gathered receipts. But even with courtroom victories behind her, politics was a different beast. She hadn't planned on running, not really. But there was a moment, one she rarely talked about. A city council meeting years ago. An older woman from her church stood up to speak about zoning changes that would push her out of her home. The officials on the panel barely looked up. One even checked his phone. Jasmine watched from the back, heart pounding, jaw clenched. That night she made a decision. If they won't listen from the podium, she'd speak from the dais. When Jasmine ran for Congress, she was outfunded, outpromised, and underestimated every step of the way. But what she lacked in resources, she made up for in reputation. The people who'd seen her fight knew she wasn't just another name on the ballot. She was their advocate, their answer, their armor. And in 2022, she won. Barely, but she won. That's where most stories would end, with the victory, the swearing in, the headline, "Freshman Congresswoman makes history." But that's not where Jasmine Crockett's real story begins. Because behind the oath and the pearls and the handshakes was a fire that had been waiting for the right moment to rise. A moment when her calm would be more terrifying than anyone's rage. when one woman armed with only facts and integrity could change the trajectory of a national conversation. That moment wasn't years away, it was coming fast. And she would be ready. Capitol Hill was colder than she expected, not just the marble floors and the echoing halls, but the smiles. Jasmine Crockett had barely set her congressional ID on the table before the whispers began. "She's new. You'll have to explain that twice." "Oh, she's the one from Dallas, right? The activist? You mean the courtroom crusader?" None of it was said cruelly. It was worse. It was said casually, offhanded, the way people talk when they don't expect to be challenged. She quickly learned that in Washington, dismissal wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was wrapped in politeness, camouflaged in compliments. "You speak so passionately." That was a fiery take. "You've got a lot of spirit. Reminds me of my daughter." But Crockett knew those weren't praise. They were codes. They meant, "You're emotional. You're inexperienced. You don't belong here." She could feel it in committee meetings. The way heads would turn 2 chairs down when a legal question came up, even though she was the only one at the table who had argued constitutional law in front of a judge. The way her questions would be interrupted, reshaped, softened for clarity, and the press, they didn't help. The first profile on her in a major outlet ran with a headline that read, "From protest to power, Crockett brings street energy to the Hill." Street energy, not constitutional literacy, not civil rights experience, just street. It stung, but not in a way that left a bruise. It stung because it was familiar, because she had felt it in classrooms, in courtrooms, in campaign offices, the assumption that her presence needed justification. But Jasmine hadn't come to Congress for validation. She came to do the work. And the work didn't care if you were underestimated. The work just needed someone who wouldn't flinch. So she did what she'd always done. She prepared. She read. She studied every bill, every writer, every line of legalese they thought she wouldn't catch. She kept receipts. And when the Judiciary Committee met for the first time that winter, she was ready. The hearing was tense. A senior official from a federal agency had been called to testify about surveillance protocols, specifically how certain neighborhoods seemed to be monitored more heavily than others. The room was thick with formality. Suits stiffened. Language became clinical. Disparities, algorithmic bias, legacy zoning patterns. Crockett listened, expression unreadable. Then calmly, she leaned into her mic and asked the witness a question no one expected. "Can you explain why black teenagers in South Dallas are 3.4 times more likely to be flagged by predictive surveillance tools? Yet there's no corresponding investment in community development in those same districts?" The room fell quiet. The witness fumbled. She continued, "Because if we're going to talk about data, let's talk about what the data really says, not what makes us comfortable." After that day, things began to shift, some quicker than others. Colleagues began forwarding her reports before meetings. A few started asking her opinion before cable news hits. But not everyone adjusted, and she didn't need them to. Jasmine wasn't there to be liked. She was there to be heard. And when she spoke, she didn't shout. She didn't preach. She didn't pander. She simply told the truth in a room not designed for it, and watched the air change. Still, the battles weren't always public. There were quiet exclusions, dinners not invited to, meetings moved last minute, alliances formed behind closed doors. But Crockett had something they couldn't track: patience. She didn't chase every headline or respond to every slight. Instead, she built. Day by day, hearing by hearing, she built her presence like scaffolding around the system itself. Because she knew her moment would come. A moment where being underestimated wouldn't be a weakness, it would be her sharpest blade. And when that moment finally arrived, she wouldn't need to raise her voice to make the whole room listen. She'd already done the work. The CNN town hall wasn't just another appearance on the schedule. It felt heavier, more electric. The kind of televised stage where political moments go to die, or to live forever. Under the blazing lights of Studio 6B, the crew moved like clockwork. Cameras slid silently across rails. Producers barked soft commands through headsets. Audience members were ushered into their rows with the kind of controlled urgency that precedes a storm. The topic of the night: national security and trust in government. But everyone knew it was more than that. It was Jasmine Crockett's first live national confrontation with a figure from the old guard, Kash Patel, and the tension backstage was thick enough to leave fingerprints in the air. The green room was colder than expected. Jasmine sat with a water bottle untouched beside her, her notes spread open but barely glanced at. She didn't need to rehearse. She had lived this moment in her mind 1,000 times. Still, her heart beat differently tonight. Not from nerves, from something deeper, a quiet fury wrapped in poise. The kind you feel when someone repeatedly questions your competence, not with facts, but with smirks. Because earlier, during the walkthrough, Patel had passed by her with a sideways glance, and a muttered line meant just loud enough to land. "Good luck tonight, Congresswoman. Hope your Twitter followers sent you some flashcards." He hadn't waited for a response. He didn't need one. That was the tone. That was the warning. And that was the mistake. Jasmine didn't flinch. Not then, not now. Because while Patel was busy crafting punchlines, she was holding something far sharper. A folder. Plain. Manila. Ordinary on the outside. But inside, documentation, timelines, inspector general's reports, and sworn affidavits that could flip the conversation in under a minute. It wasn't just opposition research. It was the kind of truth that didn't blink under stage lights. And tonight, if necessary, she'd use it. Out in the studio, the seats filled with a blend of political operatives, local voters, journalists, and curiosity seekers drawn in by the promo teasers. One side of the room leaned conservative, wearing red ties and confident smirks. The other side more diverse, more cautious, like people who'd learned to temper hope with skepticism. But everyone was watching the clock, because in 5 minutes the curtain would lift and the narrative would begin, one that Patel thought he would control. Chris Wallace adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and reviewed his notes one last time under the glow of camera rigging. Behind the curtain, Jasmine stood and closed the folder. Not in fear, in clarity. She'd spent her life preparing for moments like this. Not to trade sound bites, not to go viral, but to remind people that truth still had a place in public life. And sometimes it came dressed not in rage, but in resolve. The cue light blinked. 1 minute. Jasmine took a breath, not to calm herself, but to anchor herself. She thought of her father's call that morning. "Be steady, baby. You already know who you are." She smiled faintly, because yes, she did. And so when the producer whispered, "You're next," she didn't hesitate. She stepped toward the stage, not as a guest, but as someone walking into a room already written off, carrying something no one expected. Not just receipts, but readiness. What happened next would not only define that night, it would ripple across headlines, careers, and conversations far beyond the studio walls. Because the stage wasn't just set, it was about to be flipped. The music faded, the lights dimmed, then flared. A spotlight centered on a single podium under the towering CNN banner. Chris Wallace's voice carried with familiar authority as he welcomed the audience to tonight's special broadcast. The theme heavy with implication: security, integrity, and the future of American power. And just like that, the theater of politics was underway. Kash Patel stepped forward with the kind of practiced confidence that only comes from being both media-trained and utterly convinced of one's own narrative. Dressed in a precisely tailored gray suit, his lapel pin catching the light, he smiled. Not warmly, but knowingly. Like a man certain he'd already won the argument before it began. The applause, mostly from the right side of the room, greeted him with vigor. He waved modestly, then leaned into the microphone. "Let me start by thanking CNN and Chris Wallace for hosting this important discussion," he began, his voice smooth, commanding. "Because at a time when our national security is under daily threat, from cyber attacks, border failures, global adversaries, we need voices of experience. We need leadership that's been in the room when critical decisions are made. Not hashtags, not speeches, real-world tested intelligence." A pause, then he pivoted. "Which brings me," he said, a half-smile forming, "to the Congresswoman we'll hear from shortly." A murmur rippled across the studio. "She's new to Washington and new to these conversations. And while I respect anyone who steps up to serve their country, I worry deeply about where we're headed when the people entrusted with oversight haven't themselves ever held a classified file, been in a secured briefing, or made a life-or-death decision under pressure. The first applause hit like a slap, crisp and echoing. From one side of the room, cheers erupted. From the other, silence. A few audience members crossed their arms. Others looked toward the curtain. Patel continued, sensing momentum. We don't protect American lives with good intentions. We protect them with knowledge, experience, and yes, accountability. His voice grew sharper, more deliberate. I look forward to the conversation tonight, and I hope truly that Congresswoman Crockett brings more than just rhetoric, because national security isn't a performance, it's a responsibility. The moderator leaned forward, shifting the discussion, but the opening blow had already landed. It was a deliberate strategy. Define the terrain, question the opponent's legitimacy before she even spoke, then drape the entire stage in the aura of adulthood in the room. Patel was playing the long game, set the tone, control the expectations, disarm the audience before Crockett could load her first word. Backstage, Jasmine Crockett remained silent. She had heard every word, not through a screen, but through the thin curtain that separated the studio from the hallway where she stood. One hand rested gently on the folder, not gripping it, just aware of it, like a surgeon with a scalpel, knowing when, not just how, to use it. Her breathing was measured, eyes steady, not with fear, but calculation. She wasn't surprised, not by the jab, nor the applause, nor the smug certainty that radiated from Patel's voice. She had faced this exact tone before, in courtrooms, in boardrooms, in backrooms. Always framed as concern, always camouflaged in experience. But what Kash Patel hadn't seen, what the cameras hadn't captured yet, was that Jasmine Crockett didn't come to the stage to learn the stakes. She came already carrying them, and she was about to place them on the table. When the stage manager gave the cue, Jasmine Crockett stepped forward, not in haste, not with hesitation, but with the deliberate grace of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she was walking into. The curtain parted, and in a single measured step, she entered the spotlight. The studio light struck her navy blue pantsuit like sunlight off armor, crisp and unapologetic. The necklace she wore, silver, sharp, geometric, caught glints of stage light like fragments of steel. Her expression was composed, her stride unhurried. She wasn't walking into a debate. She was walking into history, and her poise announced it before she said a word. The audience reacted before they realized it. A ripple of stillness moved through the rows. Patel turned slightly to watch her approach, a flicker of calculation behind his controlled smile. The narrative he had tried to cast, of youth versus wisdom, emotion versus expertise, began to fray at the edges. Because Jasmine didn't look flustered or unready, she looked like someone who had already won something before she ever walked in the room. Her presence alone cracked the frame he'd built. She shook hands with Chris Wallace, then sat across from Patel, folding her hands lightly in front of her, the folder resting on the table like an unopened book with a dangerous ending. She said nothing yet, but her silence was not passive. It pressed gently against the edges of the conversation, like a tide waiting to rise. Inside, her mind was calm but fiercely alert. She had trained herself not to flinch under scrutiny, but that didn't mean she didn't feel it. She could hear the murmurs between breaths in the audience, the speculative glances, the subtle undercurrent of judgment that always met her in rooms like this. She'd lived her entire adult life being the surprise, the one they underestimated, the one they never saw coming until it was too late. And she had learned over time that this was her greatest advantage. Let them look. Let them weigh her voice before they hear it. Let them mistake her calm for softness. They would learn soon enough that quiet does not mean small, that collected does not mean submissive, that being new does not mean being unprepared, because beneath the polished suit, beneath the steady breath, she was carrying something more volatile than any accusation or applause, clarity. And clarity, when wielded well, was sharper than rhetoric and louder than shouting. She glanced at Patel as Wallace began his introduction. His eyes didn't quite meet hers. She wondered briefly if he felt it yet. The shift. The unspoken tension that enters a room when someone expected to defend themselves instead sits ready to confront. She thought about the years it had taken to master this posture, the trials, the headlines, the whispered doubts behind closed doors. How many times had she been told she was too bold, too direct, too much? And yet here she sat, not apologizing, not shrinking, not blinking. Chris Wallace turned to her with a measured tone. Joining us now is Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. The audience clapped, though less uniformly than they had for Patel. Jasmine nodded once in acknowledgement, then placed one hand gently on her folder. She was ready, not just for the questions, not just for the clash, but for what it would reveal. Because tonight, her words wouldn't just challenge the narrative, they would rewrite it. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Mr. Patel. Jasmine's voice was even, measured, and carried the kind of restraint that made people lean in to hear every syllable. No aggression, no tremor, just clarity, deliberate and unmistakably present. She turned slightly toward Patel, the hint of a smile brushing her lips. Not warm, but respectful in form. It's important, she said, to hear from former officials, especially those who've had unique experiences in national security. The word unique hung in the air like a dropped pin, subtle yet unmistakable. It wasn't said sarcastically, but it didn't have to be. The audience felt it. Patel certainly did. His smile twitched slightly at the edges, his posture adjusting by just a degree. Jasmine continued, her voice never rising, but the steel beneath it beginning to show. But I do find it interesting that Mr. Patel would question my qualifications, given that I serve on the House Judiciary Committee, where by law I'm required to participate in oversight of national security matters. That's not just a title, it's part of my constitutional responsibility. She let the sentence breathe, her gaze resting squarely on Patel. So when I raise concerns about government transparency or security policy, I'm not freelancing. I'm fulfilling my duty as outlined by the very Constitution Mr. Patel and I both swore to uphold. The audience stirred, a murmur, a shift. Not explosive, but thoughtful. A few nods, a few furrowed brows. Patel leaned forward, clearly preparing to respond, but Jasmine beat him to it with a gentle pivot. Now I want to be fair here. I respect that Mr. Patel has had access to classified briefings. That's a responsibility not to be taken lightly, but experience, in and of itself, isn't always a guarantee of sound judgment, especially when that experience is marred by a pattern of, let's call it, questionable decision-making. The words came soft, but they landed heavy. Patel blinked. His fingers tapped once against the tabletop, the rhythm brief and sharp, a giveaway for anyone watching closely. He hadn't expected her to speak this way, not with this balance of civility and challenge. Jasmine wasn't performing. She was prosecuting, quietly, and still, the folder remained untouched. But its presence loomed larger now, like a loaded file on a judge's bench, not yet admitted into evidence, but radiating the threat of revelation. Patel glanced at it once, involuntarily. Jasmine caught the glance. She didn't acknowledge it directly. She didn't need to. Her voice shifted, just slightly toward something more personal. See, I didn't come here tonight to win a shouting match. I came to clarify facts, to tell the truth, and I came prepared. Her eyes never left Patel. Because while some people confuse volume for value, I believe credibility comes from consistency. And when inconsistencies appear in someone's record, it's fair. No, it's necessary to ask questions, especially when national security is involved. The air in the studio tensed, tightening like a rope pulled from both ends. Patel opened his mouth, but Wallace interjected, his voice a thin veil trying to keep composure. Let's give the Congresswoman time to finish her point. Patel leaned back, his smirk returning, but thinner now, less sure. Jasmine turned slightly, allowing the camera to catch her profile as she placed a calm hand atop the folder. She didn't open it, not yet, but the message was clear. She was just getting started, and the next move was entirely hers. Jasmine's fingers moved with practiced precision, flipping open the manila folder with the same calm a surgeon shows before making the first incision. She didn't rush. She didn't dramatize. But somehow, the simple action of peeling back that cardboard cover sent a ripple through the studio. The audience, already leaning forward, instinctively held their breath. Patel stiffened in his seat. Not obviously, not in panic, but in the way a man sits when he senses the ground beneath him might not be as solid as it once felt. Jasmine withdrew a single document and placed it on the table between them, then looked toward the production team. "Could you bring this up on the screen, please?" she asked, her voice still smooth, still polite. The screen behind them flickered to life, displaying the top page of an official government document, complete with the seal of the Department of Defense and bold black headers that read, "Office of the Inspector General, Assessment Findings, June 2022. She didn't even look up. She knew what it said. "This report," she began, turning slightly toward the audience now, "details unauthorized disclosures of classified information during the transitional period between administrations. And on page 47, paragraph 3, Mr. Patel is identified specifically in connection with what the Inspector General described as troubling breaches of established security protocols." There was no crescendo in her voice, no punchline, just facts, delivered like a slow drip IV of truth. The audience didn't erupt, not yet, but the energy changed, heads tilted, eyebrows raised. A few audible, "Wait, what?" whispers slipped through the rows. And then came the sound every public figure dreads in a moment like this, the soft but unmistakable click of phones being raised. Dozens of screens now pointed toward the stage, recording what they knew might be the moment everything turned. Patel shifted in his seat. The confidence that had carried him through his opening remarks, the rhetorical wind in his sails, now faltered, caught in a silence too dense to talk over. "I'm familiar with many reports, Congresswoman," he said finally, his voice still composed but a half-step slower, less certain. "You'll need to be more specific." "Oh, I will be," Jasmine replied, her tone never changing. "But I wanted to begin here, because while you've questioned my qualifications tonight, I find it relevant to revisit your own conduct during your time at the Department of Defense. Conduct, I should note, that was formally investigated and found to have violated established procedure." She gestured back to the screen where Patel's name appeared in black and white, highlighted in yellow. "Now, these aren't my word," she added. "They're the words of the Inspector General, appointed, by the way, under the same administration you served." A wave of murmurs swept the room again, louder this time. Wallace blinked, glanced at his notes, then looked toward Patel, as if unsure whether to intervene or let this unfold. Patel's jaw was set, his hands folded tightly on the table in front of him. The smirk from earlier was gone, replaced by a thin line of tension stretched across his face like a fraying thread. And still, Jasmine remained composed, no triumph in her expression. Just the same unwavering poise she'd carried since the moment she stepped on stage. But behind her eyes, something else burned. A quiet resolve forged in years of being underestimated. Tonight, she wasn't just here to answer questions. She was here to raise them. Patel exhaled audibly, shifting in his seat as if trying to shake off the weight that had just landed on him. His fingers drummed briefly against the edge of the table, a small tick, barely noticeable, but revealing for anyone paying attention. He leaned into his mic with a half chuckle, a move designed to reclaim the upper hand. "This report is being completely taken out of context," he began, voice laced with the faintest trace of performative exasperation. "Let's be very clear here, Congresswoman. That document and the allegations within it have already been contested by multiple officials. There were disagreements about protocol, yes, but to call them breaches, that's not only misleading, it's politically motivated." He turned slightly toward the audience, as if pulling them into his side of the frame. "This is exactly what I mean when I say Washington has become more about optics than substance. You find one report, strip it of nuance, and suddenly I'm on trial on national television. It's a gotcha game, not a good faith discussion." He smiled thinly as though waiting for a few sympathetic chuckles. A few came, from the usual corners, but they were half-hearted. Most of the room was watching Jasmine now, not just listening, but watching, reading her body language, trying to predict her next move. She didn't flinch. She didn't look irritated or defensive. In fact, she looked almost bored, like someone who'd heard this exact refrain before. Many times. Her voice, when it came, was soft. "Mr. Patel, I understand the impulse to question the motives behind uncomfortable information. It's a common reflex. But what you seem to be forgetting is that the Inspector General who authored this report, whose findings you just labeled as politically motivated, was appointed by your own administration. The words landed with a quiet finality, not a knockout punch, but a surgical incision, precise, irrefutable, and just sharp enough to draw blood. The screen behind them still displayed the report, Patel's name highlighted. It didn't need commentary, it simply existed, unavoidable. And while we're discussing context, Crockett continued, let me point out that this report wasn't drafted in a vacuum. It followed an internal review, multiple staff interviews, and cross-agency consultations. If there's an error in the facts, we can examine that. But to wave it away as politics is not just dismissive, it's dangerous. Because if every accountability document is discredited based on who's uncomfortable with it, then what's left? Who gets to define truth? The room was still now, not with tension, but with reflection. Wallace blinked again, clearly impressed by the framing. The audience wasn't cheering, but they weren't shifting uncomfortably either. They were absorbing, learning, reassessing. Patel looked ahead, jaw tighter now. His usual rhythm of control, create doubt, claim bias, shift focus, wasn't landing as it used to. Jasmine had moved past playing defense. She wasn't batting back accusations. She was setting terms. Integrity, she said more to the room than to Patel, isn't partisan, and neither is accountability. That's not me being political. That's me doing my job. Phones went up again, clicks and flashes. Someone near the back whispered, she's not playing. And she wasn't. Jasmine Crockett wasn't there to entertain. She was there to confront, with facts, with poise, and with a clarity that didn't shout, but still silenced. The folder sat open now, pages carefully organized like a prosecutor's case file. But Jasmine had only used one, and there were more to come. Jasmine reached into the folder again, this time with even more precision, and slid out a second document. Her fingers moved like a litigator stacking a winning hand, the kind who already knows the next 3 objections that will be raised and how to render each of them irrelevant. She looked to the production booth, nodding slightly. Let's bring this one up too, she said, her voice even, deliberate. The screen behind them flickered again, and the audience collectively shifted forward in their seats, anticipating the next blow before it even landed. Office of the Inspector General. Supplementary Findings. September 2023. The title alone was enough to provoke a new wave of murmurs across the room. Patel didn't turn to look at the screen this time. He kept his eyes forward, rigid, a small muscle twitching at the corner of his jaw. Jasmine gave the moment just enough time to hang in the air before she spoke again. This is a follow-up assessment, she said, her tone now firmer, more prosecutorial. It was commissioned to evaluate the disputed portions of the original June 2022 report, and I'd like to draw your attention to paragraph 6, page 21. She glanced sideways at the audience, then back to Patel. It clearly states that while some claims were indeed contested, none of the sections related to your specific actions, particularly those surrounding unauthorized disclosures, were found to be in error. In fact, the language used here is even more direct. The highlighted portion on screen read, "No amendments are warranted regarding the previously documented security violations by Mr. K. Patel, which were corroborated through multiple internal sources." A hush settled over the studio, the kind that doesn't come from shock, but from clarity. The pieces were falling into place, not by force, not through volume, but through the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone who'd done the work and was now presenting it with devastating calm. Then, without changing tone, Jasmine shifted gears. Now that we've addressed the reports themselves, she said, lifting her gaze and locking eyes with Patel, let's talk about your testimony. The studio seemed to tighten. Patel blinked. A fragment of doubt, barely perceptible, flashed behind his eyes. Jasmine held his gaze, then nodded to the screen again. A new document appeared, this time a transcript. At the top, bold letters, House Oversight Committee, Testimony Transcript, December 13th, 2021. She pointed toward a line already highlighted on screen. You stated, and I quote, I never shared any classified information outside of authorized channels. Another beat passed. Jasmine's voice didn't waver. Now I want to be very clear. That was your sworn testimony under oath. But the Inspector General's reports, both of them, detail 3 specific incidents where you did exactly that. So my question to you, Mr. Patel, is simple. How do you reconcile that? A crack ran through the tension on Patel's face. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cinematic, but it was visible. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. His eyes darted toward the screen, then back to the folder. The smirk was gone, replaced by something tighter, less certain. Jasmine didn't press further. She didn't need to. The audience was already connecting the dots. This wasn't a clash of talking points anymore. It was a confrontation between provable fact and political spin. And Crockett, calm, poised, relentless, was in control of every piece on the board. In that moment, even the most skeptical in the room felt the shift. This wasn't about scoring points. It was about exposing the truth. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't shift in her seat or adjust her posture. But the moment she reached once more into the folder, this time with the deliberateness of someone choosing not just a page, but a turning point, the room felt it. The silence wasn't uneasy. It was electric. She pulled out a document stamped with an official letterhead and glanced once toward the screen behind her. "Let's bring this one up as well," she said quietly. And the air shifted. On the screen appeared the top of an internal communication log, redacted in parts, but still legible enough for the key details to emerge. "This," Jasmine began, "is a sequence of internal emails between senior staffers at the Department of Defense. These conversations occurred in the weeks immediately following the first internal report of classified protocol violations." The dates on the emails flashed across the screen. July 2nd, 2022, July 8th, July 17th. She continued, each word measured, sharp. What's interesting here isn't just the content, it's the timing. Because shortly after concerns were formally raised, a pattern begins to emerge. Staff who raised questions or submitted statements suddenly find themselves reassigned to unrelated departments or excluded from internal briefings altogether. The audience murmured, "The kind of sound that doesn't ask questions, it confirms suspicions." Patel shifted in his chair, visibly this time. He opened his mouth to object, but Jasmine held up one hand gently, not to silence him, but to continue uninterrupted. "And in case there's any doubt," she said, "I'd like to submit this as well." She pulled out another document, unfolding it carefully and laying it flat on the table before her. "This is a sworn affidavit from James Keller, former Deputy Director of Operations, signed, notarized, and submitted under penalty of perjury." The screen shifted again. This time the text was bold, highlighted, unflinching. "Mr. Patel stated to me directly, 'We need to clean house of anyone who doesn't understand how things work now.'" Gas broke through the room like a ripple across water. Audible, startled, real. Patel didn't speak. His eyes flicked to the screen, then to Jasmine, then downward, landing briefly on the folder, as if calculating how many more pages it might contain. His hands, once confidently clasped, now separated, one resting awkwardly on the table, the other hovering near his tie, fiddling unconsciously. Chris Wallace cleared his throat but didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. Everyone understood what was happening. Jasmine leaned slightly forward, not aggressive, but resolute. This conversation, according to the affidavit, took place just 3 days after the first security violation was formally reported. And if that's not troubling enough, Mr. Keller's statement indicates he was pressured to sign a reassignment proposal for 2 individuals involved in the original complaint, despite their active cases and seniority. The screen dimmed back to a neutral graphic, but the weight of what had been shown lingered in the air like the smell of smoke after a fire. Patel sat frozen, not enraged, not indignant, just exposed, and the audience knew it. Some leaned back slowly in their seats. Others stared at the screen, then at him. A few lifted their phones again, almost instinctively, recording this unraveling moment as though preserving it was a civic duty. Jasmine hadn't needed to shout. She hadn't needed to accuse. She simply followed the trail of evidence. And in doing so, she'd done more than challenge Patel's credibility. She'd shaken the illusion of control. The air had turned dense, like the room itself was holding its breath. Jasmine Crockett didn't sit back. She didn't retreat into her seat like a participant waiting for the next question. She stood, slowly, calmly, but with the full presence of someone who knew, without question, that the floor now belonged to her. Not because someone gave it, but because she had earned it. There was something striking about her posture. Back straight, eyes level, one hand resting lightly on the folder, while the other stayed free, open, expressive, alive. She wasn't raising her voice. She didn't need to. Her authority didn't come from volume. It came from something deeper. Lived experience, law, loss, the long road of proving oneself in rooms that doubted you before you even spoke. If I may, she said, turning slightly toward the audience now, no longer just addressing Patel. I want to take a moment, not to defend myself, but to remind you why I do what I do, why I care about oversight, about truth, about systems that work not just for the powerful, but for everyone. No one moved. Even Patel remained quiet, as if realizing that this wasn't just a moment in the debate, it was the moment. Jasmine's voice is still even, carried a quiet resonance now, the kind that rises from a deeper place. Before I ever stepped into this building, before Congress, before any of this, she gestured lightly to the lights, the cameras. I was a civil rights attorney, and I want to tell you about someone I represented a few years ago. Her name was Ayanna. She was a single mother, 2 kids, worked at a school cafeteria in East Texas, never caused trouble, never missed a shift. But one day she was photographed holding a sign at a protest, "Stop shooting us." That was all it said. 2 days later, she was fired. No explanation, no hearing, just a pink slip and a warning not to bring politics to work. She paused, letting the injustice sink in. I took her case. It didn't make headlines. We didn't have a press conference, but we fought. We went through depositions, hostile witnesses, sealed memos, procedural delays, and in the end, after months of litigation, we won. She got her job back. She got back pay. But more importantly, she got to stand up for herself in a system designed to make her feel invisible. She took one step forward now, voice stronger, more grounded. That's what drives me. That's what brought me here. Not fame, not attention, justice, fairness, accountability. And when I see someone who's held power, real power, try to spin away from oversight, to diminish others for asking questions, I don't see strength. I see fear. A subtle hush fell over the room again, but this time it wasn't confusion or shock. It was recognition. Jasmine was no longer the underestimated freshman, no longer the rebuttal. She was now the center of gravity. The audience saw her not as a politician fighting another politician, but as a woman who had walked through fire long before this night, and who brought that fire here not to destroy, but to illuminate. She slowly returned to her seat. No mic drop, no applause cue, just presence, and presence was more than enough. Jasmine let the silence linger, not to gloat, but to allow the weight of her words to settle in the room. You could feel it shift, the atmosphere, the focus, the very energy in the air. Chris Wallace, normally crisp and controlled, hesitated before speaking. You could tell he wasn't sure whether to jump in or simply let the moment breathe. He chose the latter. And Jasmine, reading the room with a grace honed not in TV studios, but in courtrooms and community centers, leaned gently into the pause. This isn't about left or right, she said softly, her voice now lower, warmer. It's not about blue states or red states or who's up in the polls this week. Her tone no longer carried the edge of a cross-examination. Instead, it softened into something more intimate, almost maternal. Like a Sunday evening conversation around a kitchen table, one where truth isn't weaponized but offered like a hand across difference. She turned slightly toward the audience, not to perform but to connect. This is about trust, about truth, about whether the American people can look at those in power and believe that someone, anyone, We'll hold them accountable when they lie, when they deflect, when they fail to protect what matters most. Patel shifted again, but she didn't even glance at him. Her focus wasn't on the opposition anymore. It was on the people watching, here in the room and out there across the country. It's easy to sit behind microphones and argue, she continued, her voice steadier now. Easy to get lost in sound bites and slogans. But somewhere out there, a young girl is watching this, a teacher, a veteran, a mother, someone who's been told they're too small, too unimportant to question power. And to them, I want to say this clearly. You are not too small. Your voice is not too weak. And asking questions, demanding answers, is not a sign of rebellion. She paused just long enough, then with almost whispered conviction, it's a sign of patriotism. The effect was immediate. The audience didn't cheer. They didn't clap. Instead, they stilled completely. Phones lowered, heads tilted. Even Wallace, a veteran of decades of interviews, looked down briefly, then back up, as if unsure how to carry on from something so plainly human. Jasmine's expression had changed too. Less steely now, more vulnerable. And that shift, subtle but powerful, wasn't lost on anyone. She wasn't just leading a debate, she was telling a truth too large to fit in partisan frames. This, she said finally, gesturing not to the folder, not to Patel, but to the very idea of accountability. This is about America's soul. And with that, the silence in the studio became something sacred, a rare, unscripted stillness in modern political theater. Patel didn't speak. Wallace cleared his throat but didn't force a transition. For once, no one rushed to fill the space. Because in that moment, everyone knew. They weren't just watching a confrontation. They were witnessing a lesson in justice. The red light above the camera dimmed, signaling the start of a commercial break. The moment the show cut to ads, Patel stood, quick, stiff, almost mechanical. He didn't speak to Wallace, didn't glance at Crockett. A producer approached him, headset in hand, likely to re-mic him for the next segment. But he brushed past without acknowledging her. His stride was sharp, clipped, the kind of walk a man uses not to move, but to flee with dignity. He disappeared backstage, jaw tight, suit jacket unbuttoned, pulling out his phone like a drowning man reaching for a life preserver. The murmur of his voice, low, urgent, trailed just far enough to catch. Get me Greg at Fox. We need to get ahead of this narrative. Now. Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She remained seated, hands folded gently in front of her, eyes steady on the darkened studio, as if watching the weight of what had just unfolded settle into the walls. A producer offered her water. She took it with a nod, not a word. Her breathing was measured, her shoulders relaxed. She wasn't basking. She wasn't savoring. She was still working, still processing every line, every shift in tone, every reaction. Because she knew this wasn't over. It was just beginning. In the audience, something had changed. The earlier buzz, the performative tension of a live broadcast, had evolved into something deeper, something quieter, and far more potent. People weren't whispering about policy anymore. They were whispering about what they had just seen. A woman so calm, so prepared, so impossibly in control, dismantle a man whose career had been built on control itself. She just ended his career, someone in the third row said. Not with glee, but with stunned conviction. 3 rows back, a younger viewer whispered, That folder? That folder was a whole strategy. And while the studio buzzed in low tones, outside the room, the internet had already exploded. Within 90 seconds of the break, Twitter, now X, had lit up with the hashtag #, Crockett receipts. Short clips from the segment were already being clipped, subtitled and shared with captions like, She brought documents. He brought attitude. Another read, That wasn't a debate. That was a masterclass in preparation. The most viral tweet in the first 3 minutes featured a side-by-side image. Patel, smiling as he began his opening remarks, juxtaposed with him walking off stage mid-break. Lips tight, head down. The caption read simply, How it started, how it ended. Cable news producers scrambled to grab screen recordings. Instagram accounts that normally focused on pop culture pivoted to post reels of Crockett's calm takedown. TikTok creators stitched reaction videos in real time, pausing to gasp, analyze, and repeat Jasmine's key lines with awe. Inside the studio, as the countdown to return from break ticked down, Wallace glanced toward Crockett. She gave a small nod, signaling she was ready. Of course she was. She had never stopped being ready. Patel had left the stage in retreat. Crockett never left her seat. And in the quiet between those two truths, a new narrative was born. One not of noise, but of substance. Not of theatrics, but of truth. And the whole country was watching. Somewhere between the swelling hashtags and the vibrating notifications, Jasmine Crockett sat quietly backstage, her folder now closed but her mind wide open. Not to glory, not to triumph, but to memory. She wasn't the first to sit at a table and speak a truth the room didn't want to hear. And as she looked down at her hands, still steady, still calm, she thought about all the women whose fingerprints lived invisibly on her own. Barbara Jordan, Shirley Chisholm, Maxine Waters, and more recently, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Women who had not only entered the room, but changed it. There was a particular afternoon she hadn't thought about in years, until now. She was 16, sitting cross-legged on the floor of her grandmother's house in East Dallas. It was hot, the kind of sticky southern heat that clings to your skin. The TV buzzed in the background, but Jasmine wasn't paying attention. She had found a weathered book on the shelf, spine cracked, cover faded. Inside were speeches, political ones. Her grandmother had marked her favorites in the margins with loops of blue ink. One page was starred 3 times. Barbara Jordan's opening statement from the House Judiciary Committee hearings during Watergate, 1974. Jasmine read it aloud, voice unsure at first. My faith in the Constitution is whole. It is complete. It is total. She said the words again, slower, then again, louder. She didn't know it at the time, but something inside her shifted that day. Something that would grow. It wasn't just the words. It was the stillness they held, the moral weight. Jordan hadn't shouted either. She didn't posture. She sat, and from that seat reshaped the arc of the moment. Jasmine saw something in that. Not performance, not pageantry, presence. Now, decades later, Jasmine had found herself in that same seat, literally and figuratively, on live television, calling for accountability not with outrage, but with receipts. She hadn't invoked Jordan's name. She hadn't needed to, but anyone paying attention saw the lineage. Just like Shirley Chisholm had refused to be bought or bossed, Jasmine had refused to be boxed in by assumptions, titles, or years of experience used as weapons. Just like AOC had flipped committee room dynamics with pointed, data-driven questions, Jasmine had used facts to corner a man who thought power came with immunity. It wasn't mimicry, it was memory in motion, echo turned evolution. Later that night, when someone posted a side-by-side clip of Barbara Jordan at the Watergate hearings and Jasmine Crockett at the CNN town hall, the resemblance wasn't visual, it was spiritual. The cadence, the clarity, the calm refusal to let truth be bulldozed by bravado. In that moment, viewers weren't just seeing a congresswoman. They were witnessing a continuation of every woman who ever walked into a room built to exclude her and made it hers. Of every voice that had once been dismissed as too emotional, too young, too loud, too soft, but spoke anyway. Jasmine had carried those voices into the studio that night, and now they echoed back, amplified, not as ghosts, but as legacy. Outside the CNN building, the air pulsed with the kind of energy that lingers after something bigger than expected has just occurred. The crowd hadn't been large to begin with, just a modest cluster of reporters, a few curious onlookers, and some activists holding handmade signs. But after the confrontation aired, the sidewalks began to swell. Young women with their phones clutched tightly in hand pulled up clip after clip, replaying Jasmine Crockett's calm takedown with wide eyes and knowing smiles. Several of them mouthed the words along with her like they were lyrics from a song they'd been waiting their whole lives to hear. Across the country, Black women, mothers, daughters, students, organizers were flooding social media not just with praise, but with something more intimate, recognition. One tweet read, "I don't care what your politics are. Jasmine Crockett just made me feel like I belonged in that room." Another, "She carried all of us in that folder. Every dismissal, every side eye, every time we were told to smile more or say less. Tonight she said exactly what we couldn't." The hashtag number sign Crockett receipts evolved into more than just a moment of digital celebration. It became a banner, a statement, a signal flare that something had shifted, not in the structure of government, perhaps, but in the spirit of representation. Videos surfaced of high school debate teams watching the segment in real time, pausing to take notes not just on content, but on tone, posture, patience. In one viral clip, a teacher paused the video and asked, "What just happened here?" A black girl in the front row replied simply, "She showed them we're not afraid to come with the truth." Jasmine sat alone for a few minutes after the show wrapped, the buzz of studio teardown humming around her. She finally checked her phone, and the screen lit up with so many messages the notifications blurred into a constant stream. Friends, constituents, strangers. One message stood out. It came from a woman she didn't recognize. "I watched with my daughter tonight. She's 11. After it ended, she said, 'Mom, I want to be like her. I want a folder too. I just wanted you to know. You made her feel powerful.'" The message hit deeper than any headline. Jasmine leaned back, letting the weight of it wash over her. Not pride in a performative sense, but something more sacred, a sense of having shown up, not just for herself, but for every little black girl who had ever been told to shrink to fit a space too small for her fire. Tonight, she hadn't asked for permission. She hadn't waited to be invited to the center. She'd stepped into it and carried a generation with her. Because this wasn't just a win. It wasn't just a powerful moment or a trending clip. It was the spark of something bigger, a ripple turning into a wave, a reminder that when you bring truth to power, with your head high, your facts in hand, and your ancestors' voices in your heart, it doesn't just echo, it moves people. And that's how movements begin. The town car had barely pulled away from the CNN studio when Jasmine's phone buzzed again, then again. It hadn't stopped since the segment ended, but now it vibrated with a different kind of rhythm. Not the scattered applause of strangers. These were deliberate taps from inside the machine, campaign managers, legislative aides, elected officials, people who normally sent emails, not texts, people who usually waited until the press cycle cleared. Tonight they weren't waiting. She glanced down at the screen, a message from a well-known activist. "That was thunder in a velvet glove. You just raised the bar." Another from a Hollywood name she'd only ever seen on screen. "If you ever run for Senate, I'll throw the first fundraiser. No lie." A flood of comments from her district, some emotional, some strategic, all grateful. "You made us proud tonight, Rep. I've never felt more seen. Keep holding them accountable. You didn't blink. That's leadership." But it was the one that came in with no name attached, just House leadership, that made her pause. "Let's talk committee seats. We've been watching. You're ready for more." Jasmine stared at the message for a long second, the corners of her mouth curling upward, not in surprise, not in triumph, but in quiet confirmation. This wasn't about celebration. It was validation of the strategy she had held fast to all along. Do the work, show the receipts, and let the truth shift the room. For months, she'd been told to wait her turn, to build relationships first, to be careful not to rock the boat. And she had smiled through those conversations, filed them away, and kept building her case, step by step, hearing by hearing. What they hadn't realized was that she wasn't waiting for permission. She was preparing for opportunity. And now the opportunity had blinked across her screen in 11 simple words. Still, her smile wasn't for the attention. It wasn't even for the political doors now cracking open. It was for what those doors represented: leverage. Not for herself, but for her agenda. For the legislation she knew would never see daylight unless she had a seat at the right tables. For the families in her district whose issues never made it past a staffer's inbox. For the whistleblowers. For Ayanna. For every story that was real but buried under bureaucracy. She looked out the window as the car wound through late-night D.C., her phone still buzzing beside her. It could wait. They could all wait. For once, the power brokers were on her time. In a city built on noise, she had found her way by being precise, by being ready, and by being unshakably herself. She hadn't gone viral for a soundbite. She'd gone viral for substance, and in the spaces where real change is negotiated, in back rooms and phone calls and text messages like this, people were finally taking notice. The path ahead wouldn't be easier. In fact, it might be harder now. Brighter lights, bigger targets, higher stakes. But Jasmine Crockett hadn't come to D.C. to play safe. She came to play smart, and now the game was shifting. In a private conference room inside a GOP strategy office just blocks from Capitol Hill, the mood was brittle. Phones buzzed on the table, but no one reached for them. A muted TV in the corner played the replay from CNN, and though the sound was off, the images told the story clearly enough. Jasmine Crockett, composed, clear-eyed, unshaken, methodically dismantling Patel's credibility while he sat there, shoulders slowly tightening, the smirk fading in real time. A junior staffer broke the silence. "We need a response, fast." The room remained still for a moment longer before one of the senior aides, a man in his 50s with 3 decades of campaign scars, finally spoke. "We underestimated her." Another chimed in. He underestimated her. And now we're the ones left holding the bag. Within hours of the broadcast, conservative news outlets had already mobilized. The headlines were carefully chosen. CNN sets a trap. Crockett ambushes former Trump official. Gotcha politics at its worst. GOP strategist Kash Patel targeted in televised hit job. But the damage was already bleeding into corners the party couldn't spin away. Independent voters were posting side-by-side comparisons of Patel's body language before and after the folder appeared. Clips of Crockett's calm recitation of dates, names, and quotes were making their way into unlikely echo chambers. And then came the internal text chains. From conservative think tanks, "She buried him." No theatrics, just proof. From mid-tier campaign managers, "Who prepped Patel for that?" He walked into a buzzsaw. Even from a notoriously fiery right-wing commentator in a private group thread. "Look, I don't like her politics, but that woman came to play. Y'all better stop underestimating these freshman Dems." The language wasn't always public, but the sentiment was impossible to ignore. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just scored a point, she had redefined the game. Back at Patel's own team headquarters, the air was thick with quiet tension. The usual post-interview spin memo hadn't gone out. The comms director was still reviewing the clip, trying to find a 30-second segment where Patel looked remotely in control. They weren't finding one. One aide suggested weakly, "Maybe we pushed the narrative that she violated decorum, went too aggressive." But even he didn't believe it. Someone else muttered, "It's not aggressive to come with documents." Outside, Fox News hosts leaned heavily into the ambush narrative. Their language was tight, controlled, careful not to criticize Patel directly, but rather the setup. Yet on conservative Reddit boards and Discord servers, the conversation was more candid. She destroyed him with facts. He wasn't ready. This isn't just about her. This is about what we're not preparing for. Within 48 hours, several GOP lawmakers had already distanced themselves, subtly shifting their talking points. Patel's name didn't come up in morning interviews. In hallway gaggles, when asked about the incident, some deflected. Others laughed uncomfortably. One simply shook his head and said, "Next question." Behind closed doors, they weren't asking whether Patel had lost the debate. They were asking if Crockett had just become a bigger threat than they'd planned for, and none of them had an answer they liked. The moment the cameras stopped rolling, the political world turned its eyes toward Jasmine Crockett. But unlike so many before her, who'd gone viral and spent their newfound attention chasing cable slots or building brands, Jasmine did something quieter and far more potent. She got back to work. 2 days after the town hall, she introduced new amendments to a pending voting rights bill, clauses that would expand early voting access in federal elections and standardize ballot drop-off protections across all states. A week later, she co-sponsored a comprehensive police reform package focused on national standards for use of force reporting and independent review boards for officer-involved deaths. It wasn't flashy legislation. It didn't dominate headlines, but it had teeth and a roadmap. She walked into committee hearings with folders just like the one from the debate, this time filled with data, case law, precedent. Her speeches didn't go viral for their fire. They went viral for their focus. She didn't trade in spectacle. She delivered substance with the kind of clarity that made even her opposition lean in, if only to figure out where the next blow would land. Clips from her Judiciary Committee appearances started circulating on social media. Clips where she deconstructed legal loopholes in voter ID laws, where she exposed the financial incentives behind militarized policing. She cited not only statistics, but stories. Mothers who'd buried sons, neighborhoods left voiceless by closed polling places, young men sentenced unfairly under vague statutes. And she always brought it back to the same core principle: dignity. The dignity of being heard, of being counted, of being protected. In one particularly charged hearing on the renewal of the Voting Rights Act, a senior committee member questioned the urgency of her proposals. He called them aspirational. Jasmine paused, looked him straight in the eye, and replied with quiet force, "Aspirational? Sir, what's aspirational about making sure an elderly black woman in Alabama doesn't have to ride 2 buses to cast a ballot? What's aspirational about protecting democracy from dying in zip codes that don't look like yours?" The clip hit 6 million views in 2 days. And then, during a campus town hall in Atlanta, when a student asked her how she stayed so focused in the noise, she gave a response that would find itself printed on protest signs, pinned on Instagram bios, and repeated by 1,000 organizers in community meetings across the country. "We don't fight for claps, we fight for change." It was simple, undeniable. And it told the story not just of Jasmine Crockett, but of the kind of leadership rising quietly in her wake. Not seeking celebrity, but effectiveness. Not fueled by ego, but by service. The spotlight hadn't changed Jasmine. It had illuminated what was already there. And now it was following her, not to celebrate, but to document. Because people were paying attention. And this time, they weren't just watching, they were hoping. It started as a whisper in classrooms, a line repeated quietly in school hallways, on debate team group chats, at kitchen tables between bites of homework. She brought the folder. She knew the report by page number. She didn't even flinch. In a high school debate club just outside of Raleigh, North Carolina, a group of juniors dissected the now famous CNN clip during their weekly meeting. The club president paused the video and turned to the room. "See what she did here?" he asked, pointing to the moment Jasmine calmly cited paragraph 6, page 21. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. In a classroom across the country, a teacher challenged her students to analyze political rhetoric. One girl raised her hand and asked, "Can we do the Jasmine Crockett strategy?" The teacher asked what that meant. "Facts first, no yelling, just receipts." The ripple was real, and it was growing. Then came the shirts. It started online, first as memes, then as mock-ups. But within a week, they were real. Cotton, bold font, a plain manila folder printed over the heart. Underneath the words, "Check the documents." Another variation read simply, "Crockett Energy." They popped up on Etsy, on streetwear sites, at college rallies. They weren't just fashion. They were armor for a new kind of engagement. A statement: you can be calm and still command. You can be new and still know your ground. And then, in her home state of Texas, something even more lasting appeared. On the side of a community center in South Dallas, just 5 blocks from where Jasmine grew up, a mural began to take shape. It started with a soft outline in chalk. Then came the brushwork. Local artists collaborated. Kids stopped by after school to help paint. The scene was unmistakable. Jasmine Crockett, standing in a sharp navy blue suit, a folder clutched confidently in one hand, her other hand raised. Not in protest, but in presence. Around her names in delicate script: Chisholm, Jordan, Truth, Crockett. Above her image, in looping gold letters, "Truth needs no permission." The mural unveiling drew hundreds. Students, elders, single moms with toddlers on their hips. Local politicians showed up, but they didn't speak. The mic belonged to the community. One middle schooler stepped up and said through nervous excitement, She made me believe you don't have to be loud to be powerful. You just have to be right and ready. Jasmine hadn't known about the mural until the week before. When she arrived and saw it in full color for the first time, she stood motionless for several seconds. Not because she was overwhelmed by attention, but by the quiet realization that somewhere along the way, her preparation had become a message. Her discipline, her clarity, her unshakable presence. They weren't just strategy. They were legacy in motion. She didn't cry. She didn't speechify. She just smiled, hand resting softly over the folder painted near her chest. Because in that moment, she understood. Leadership wasn't about the volume of your voice. It was about the weight of your truth. And she had given the next generation something to carry. The room was quiet, save for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of a city that never quite slept. It was late. Too late for strategy calls, too early for interviews. Jasmine sat on the edge of the hotel bed, the soft glow of a single lamp casting long shadows on the floor. Her shoes had been kicked off. The navy blue blazer hung carefully on a chair. The folder, that folder, rested on the nightstand beside a bottle of water and a now cold cup of tea. She was alone, and for the first time in days, the silence didn't feel like an intermission. It felt like a return. Her phone buzzed again, but she didn't check it. Instead, she turned back to the envelope in her hand, one she'd picked up from her Capitol Hill office before leaving for the event in Dallas. It had been buried beneath stacks of legislative reports and policy drafts. There was no sender's name on the front, just careful handwriting written in pink ink. To Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. She had opened it earlier that evening but hadn't had time to finish. Now, in the stillness of the hotel room, she read it again, this time slowly. Dear Congresswoman, my name is Tiana. I'm 12 years old and I live in Detroit. I saw you on TV and told my mom I want to be like you. My teacher said I'm too quiet for debate team, but I think you proved that quiet people can be strong too. You made me believe I could be strong and kind. I hope I get to meet you one day. Love. Tiana. Jasmine sat back, her throat tightening, not with sadness, not even with pride, but with a fullness she couldn't name, a truth too wide for language. She reached for a pen and one of the thank you cards she always kept in her travel bag. She rarely had time to handwrite responses anymore. Tonight, she made time. Dear Tiana, thank you for your beautiful letter. You don't have to be the loudest voice in the room to be heard. You just have to tell the truth and believe in it. Strength isn't always about force. Sometimes it's about grace. I hope you do join the debate team. And if anyone doubts you, let them. That's your superpower. Keep going. Keep asking questions and never forget. Being kind doesn't mean being weak. It means being wise enough to know when to listen and when to speak. And when you do, speak with your whole heart. With love, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. As she signed her name, a single tear slipped quietly down her cheek. She didn't brush it away. Because this letter, this connection, this quiet moment was why she did the work. Not for cameras, not for claps, but for a girl named Tiana who saw in her not a politician, but a possibility. Jasmine placed the card in an envelope, sealed it, and set it atop the folder beside her. Then she leaned back, let the quiet settle around her again, and smiled, not because she'd won, but because someone else now believed they could. We may not all find ourselves sitting beneath the hot lights of a CNN stage, facing down a political opponent with years of experience and a smirk that says, "You don't belong here." We may never hold a manila folder that shifts the balance of a national conversation, but make no mistake, we all have a Patel in our lives. That person who questions your worth before hearing your words. That manager, colleague, neighbor, or figure in power who thinks credentials outweigh character, who talks louder and longer in hopes that no one notices the hollowness beneath the surface. And like Jasmine Crockett, we've all been in rooms where we were expected to shrink, to defer, to let the moment pass because speaking up felt too risky, too lonely, too exhausting. But here's the truth. We all carry a folder. It may not hold government reports or inspector general statements, but it holds something just as powerful. Our experience, our preparation, our values, our evidence of who we are and what we've survived. And sometimes that folder is filled not with paper, but with moments, quiet victories, small truths, real receipts that no one else sees, but that we carry with us every day. Jasmine didn't win that night because she embarrassed someone on television. She won because she reminded the country, reminded us, that grace under fire isn't weakness, that coming prepared is a form of love, that showing up calmly and clearly, with facts in hand and purpose in heart, can still cut through all the noise. She stood not just for herself, but for the people watching from the margins, the ones told they weren't ready, that their truth wasn't enough, that their voices were too soft, too new, too different. She stood for the mothers, the daughters, the organizers, the whistleblowers, and she stood for those still finding the courage to open their own folders. So maybe the question isn't just about Jasmine Crockett. Maybe the real question is about us. Will we be ready when our name is called? Will we sit in the seat we've earned, even when the room wasn't built for us? Will we prepare, not just to respond, but to lead? Will we protect the truth, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's lonely? Because the day will come, maybe in a boardroom, maybe in a classroom, maybe in your own home, when someone will question your place, when you'll feel the weight of being doubted. And in that moment, you'll have a choice, to stay silent or to reach for the folder. So I leave you with this. When that moment comes, not if, but when, will you be ready? Will you bring the receipts? And if there's one truth that rises from this story, one thread that weaves through every pause, every document, every steady breath, it is this. Silence is not the absence of power. It is often where power begins. Jasmine Crockett taught us that you don't need to shout to be heard, that you don't need to dominate to lead, that in a world obsessed with instant reaction, there is still room, still reverence for the person who listens, learns, prepares, and then speaks with precision. She reminded us that dignity is not given, it's practiced, that truth is not something you memorize, it's something you live. And most of all, she reminded us that you don't have to be perfect to be principled. You don't have to be famous to be fearless. You just have to be ready when it counts. So whatever your folder holds, memories, facts, scars, truths too long ignored, know this. Its value is not in how loudly you wave it, but in how wisely you use it. Truth, when carried with integrity, does not need approval. It demands respect. Let this story not be an exception, but a reminder that when you walk into a room, you carry not only your story, but the quiet strength of everyone who came before you. The ones who were overlooked, the ones who were silenced, the ones who refused to fold. And maybe, just maybe, you'll become the echo someone else will one day follow. This video contains commentary, original analysis, and narrative construction for the purpose of public discourse, critique, and education. All excerpts and references fall under fair use guidelines as defined by U.S. copyright law. Because this wasn't just a televised exchange, it was a masterclass in courage. And courage, when anchored in truth, doesn't just survive the moment, it defines it. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.